Hi, Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes told CBS This Morning in 2015 how she would transform blood tests by using just drops of blood pricked from a finger to get fast, low-cost test results for everything from cholesterol to cancer. She also convinced investors to sink hundreds of millions of dollars into the company. I'm sitting here with John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal, who first broke this story and has now written a book called Bad Blood. First of all, let's talk about Elizabeth Holmes. She started this company at what age?
19. She dropped out of Stanford in the middle of her sophomore year and originally launched it as a real-time cures and then changed the name to Theranos, and that's a combination of the words therapy and diagnosis.
Everyone I talked to on this story for 60 Minutes says it's a great idea, right? The blood testing industry is ripe for disruption.
It is a great idea. I mean, it's true what Elizabeth said at the height of her fame a few years ago. People don't like to go get their blood tested. They don't like the needle. They don't like it. They don't like the fact that you have 5 tubes of blood that have to be, taken, and people, as a result, avoid getting their blood drawn, and it probably does result in fewer timely diagnoses.
She was able to convince a lot of powerful people to get behind her. George P. Shultz, the former Secretary of State, also former Secretary of Labor,
Right.
so well regarded. He was one of the first to buy in.
Absolutely. Larger-than-life figure, crafted the Reagan administration's foreign policy. Many people credit him with winning the Cold War. And he was a key figure in this Theranos saga because Elizabeth met him in 2011. And as I understand it, Mr. Shultz is passionate about science, and she really wowed him with her vision. And soon after meeting her, joined her board and became her biggest champion, and then introduced her to his friends from the Hoover Institution, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, all these aging former statesmen who, by the way, had no background in medicine and didn't know anything about laboratory science.
In fact, you call it one of the most illustrious corporate boards in American history.
Right. It was an incredibly prestigious board. And in fact, one of the investors in Theranos was this hedge fund based in San Francisco that invested almost $100 million in early 2014. And when its 2 top guys went to Theranos to meet with Elizabeth and Sonny, her boyfriend, who's the number 2 executive, they were impressed with the claims that Elizabeth and Sonny made and the charts of data and everything, and the financial projections, but they were also wowed by the board. Mm-hmm. The board, was part of what sold them on the company, and it didn't occur to them that a startup with such a prestigious board, that anything could be going wrong there.
Mm-hmm. She's been charged by the SEC, and if you look at those documents, they accuse her of an elaborate years-long fraud. In fact, they called it massive fraud.
Right.
Where was some of this fraud? Where did we see it? Mm-hmm.
Well, the unethical behavior, as I explain in my book, started at an early stage. In 2006, she fired her CFO when he confronted her about these fake demos that they were doing for prospective investors. But where this really became a big, big fraud is when the bright red line was crossed in the fall of 2013 of going into Walgreens stores and offering the Theranos finger stick tests in Walgreens stores in Palo Alto and in the Phoenix area, because then you cross over into affecting patient health. I mean, these are real patients, real lives that were at stake.
We'll get to that in just a moment, but I want to talk about Elizabeth Holmes herself. Blonde, blue-eyed, brilliant, a billionaire by essentially 2013 when
Right.
the company had already raised about $700 million. And her voice, she had this very deep voice.
Right.
Was that affected?
Yeah, that was part of the act as well. One of the anecdotes in the book is that a new employee met with her in 2011, and it was at the end of a long day, and she was getting up from her chair and expressed excitement that he had joined the company. And she forgot to put on the baritone for a moment and slipped into a more natural-sounding young woman's voice. Mm-hmm. And at that point, it dawned on him that it was a put-on.
Yeah, it's so funny because everybody who watched the 60 Minutes piece again said, oh my gosh, her voice is so unusual.
Right.
It's so deep. But I wonder if that was part of her way in a male-dominated Silicon Valley of trying to, and also in the investor world of trying to, portray sort of importance or whatever it was. I mean, there was this whole kind of mythology. You've used that word, a cult around her. And I keep thinking, too, we've had Steve Jobs, we've had Mark Zuckerberg, we've had Bill Gates, all men who dropped out of Ivy League schools like she did. And people were rooting for a woman to succeed in Silicon Valley. People were rooting for Elizabeth Holmes. Right.
There was a yearning for a billionaire female startup founder. I mean, there had been other women in Silicon Valley in recent years who had risen to fame, like Marissa Mayer, Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook, but they hadn't created the companies. They were the hired help in a way. And Elizabeth Holmes was going to be the first female billionaire founder. And people really wanted her to succeed for that reason in part. And then what you say about Silicon Valley is very true. It's really overwhelmingly a man's world. And I think she put on the voice, the deeper voice, to be taken seriously. And in a way, I can understand that.
So we talked about this finger prick, right, where you could get a couple drops of blood. The proprietary technology was that she had developed was essentially the Edison. There was later a mini lab. There were some different forms of it. But it was supposed to be the iPod of healthcare, right? Like in the future, someday it would be sitting in your office. You could put some blood in there.
Or at home even. She wanted it to be at home.
Go Wi-Fi to your doctor. Your doctor said your cholesterol levels look too high. I'm going to prescribe some more Lipitor or whatever. So good idea. They couldn't ever get this machine to work.
No.
It's just rudimentary in design, right?
Right. So there were 3 iterations, basically, of the technology. 4, if you count the fact that at first she had this vision for this arm patch, which was really science fiction. And then the second one was this microfluidic device that was like the size of a toaster. They tried to work on that for several years, shelved it. And then they pivoted to what was essentially a converted glue dispensing robot. And it was an robotic arm on a gantry with a pipette at the end of it that sort of replicated the steps that a lab scientist does on the bench to test blood. And that ended up being called the Edison. It had a sleek black and white case, but it really could only do one class of tests known as immunoassays, and it didn't do those tests even well.
And what was the one test it could do for?
They were called immunoassays, tests that use antibodies to bind to the substance in the blood that you're trying to measure. So the Edison was an immunoassay machine, but she was saying even as work on the mini lab, the successor machine hadn't even started, she was telling Walgreens and Safeway that she already had a machine that could do everything.
And this was part of the elaborate fraud that's discussed. You write about it in the book. We talked to some of the same insiders that are your sources here too, that essentially I'm interested in maybe donating $100 million. You would go into Theranos headquarters and they would say, oh, come right here. They would take your blood, they would put it in a little cartridge into the Edison, and then they would
say... Into the mini lab. They would show investors the mini lab, not even the Edison that was in the lab, but the mini lab, which was but a malfunctioning prototype.
Yeah, and so they would say, now let's take you up to the business offices and have lunch and wine and dine you. And then as Doug Matchey said on 60 Minutes, they would then pull the cartridge out and then actually have scientists tested by hand. It never worked.
That's right.
And then, when the investor would come back down, they would hand them the test results. And as one mentioned to me, usually, though, someone in business affairs signed off, and if there was anything that looked bad, they would just kind of cross it off. It was edited. I mean, it was a fake, it was a whole bait and switch.
It was a bait and switch, and in fact, Tyler Schultz, who I later revealed was one of my confidential sources, the grandson of George Schultz, was stymied in trying to call his grandfather's attention to the fact that it was a fraud by the fact that George had experienced one of those fake demos. And he said, I've done it. I've seen the machine. It's tested my blood. The results were accurate. So, Tyler, you're wrong. I saw it with my own eyes.
But he hadn't seen it with his own eyes.
He'd seen the fake demo.
The fake demo. The other interesting thing you reveal in your book, and I thought this was relevant because someone said, did the media miss this story early on? Why did everyone believe what was going on was this fraud? And part of the fraud was she had 2 laboratories, right? There was, and so she was able to deceive regulators this way too. There was something called Normandy. where they were doing all of the futuristic type stuff where they were going to storm the beach of medicine, right?
But which also mainly was hacked Siemens machines that they had repurposed for small samples, which is not innovation.
But as you point out in your book, that was like downstairs.
That was downstairs and
no
hidden.
windows, no windows. Then there was what was called
Jurassic Park.
And meaning older stuff up there, but it was one that the cameras went in and that they let the investors in, et cetera.
Well, especially Jurassic Park was where they showed the inspectors. They said, see, we have a lab with regular commercial machines, and we have a lab director, and that's what the inspectors, the CLIA inspectors, who represent one of the health regulators, saw. And so they didn't even see the lab downstairs, and those Edison machines that didn't work well and those Siemens machines that were hacked, they didn't even see that room. So regulators were lied to.
What's the future like for Elizabeth Holmes? She is still CEO, but the company is virtually bankrupt.
It's amazing. She's still CEO. The company is still a going concern for now, but she just laid off another 100 employees last month. So the head count's down to about 20 people. And she wrote an email to investors in which she said that the company would probably be liquidated and its assets seized and liquidated by a private equity fund by the summer. Before then, or possibly after then, I expect to see an announcement from the Justice Department. The U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco has been conducting a criminal investigation for more than 2 years now. And I'm told by sources that that investigation is close to drawing to a close and that indictments are a distinct possibility.
Any day now. Your book is being made into a movie.
That's right.
And who will play Elizabeth Holmes?
Jennifer Lawrence.
Jennifer Lawrence. And who's writing the screenplay?
Vanessa Taylor, who co-wrote the screenplay for the Best Picture,
Shape of Water.
Shape of Water.
Wow, that's pretty good to get someone who just won Best Picture.
Right. No, it's a great combination of talent.
And directed by?
Adam McKay, who did The Big Short.
So Hollywood's interested in this story as well.
Right. Yeah. I think it's a story that could make a good movie.
Yeah. Well, it makes a great book. John Carreyrou, thank you. It's been nice to talk to you over the years. Your reporting is really terrific.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.